Good afternoon, and welcome to the Advanced Crop Advisors Workshop. My name is Greg Endres. I serve as a co-organizer for the workshop, and so I'm very pleased to welcome you to our program. We wish we could visit with you face to face, but that's the way it is currently. Yes, on the plus side, it's certainly frigid cold out there, and so we're pleased that people do not have to travel to come to the workshop. And I remember last year, for those of you that attended, we had to readjust our schedule because of the blizzard that occurred between the first and second day. And so there are some advantages with doing this virtual, but so we'll do the best we can. It's been a fairly challenging process in developing the program, and hopefully delivery will go very well. But anyway, we've worked hard to try to bring you a quality program, and hope that indeed does happen. So we have the extension is organizing the program, and it involves the University of Minnesota Extension Service as well as the North Dakota State University Extension. So we spearhead the work on organizing the program with help from others, and then deliver it. So there's a lot of people that are involved, and this is a look at the workshop planning committee. The other co-chair is Angie Piltier from the University of Minnesota Extension, and Angie will be visiting with you in just a bit. Some other people I want to mention, one on the bottom of the list, but on the top of our list for organization and delivery is Linda Schuster. Linda is with NDSU Extension. She's based at the Carrington Research Extension Center as our administrative secretary. And so we want to acknowledge Linda for her work in helping primarily with registration and also certainly helping with providing the technical assistance on delivering the program today. She does a lot of things as well. One other person that's not listed here is Scott Swanson. Scott is also with NDSU Extension. He's providing some behind-the-scene technical support, so we appreciate that as well. And then the rest of the list are people that we're pleased to help us as a planning committee member, and their names are listed, but I'll just mention the names quickly. Jerry Arneson and Darren Dunham and Chris Johnson are three. I believe none of these fellows will be able to join us today because of some other commitments, but we appreciate their work. We also see Dave Franson. He's been a long-term committee member, has made many contributions to our program in the past, and this year it's included. He'll be a speaker, and he's also a moderator for one of the sessions actually this afternoon. And then we have a couple brand new persons, Tom Jones and Lindsay Lesney, and we're pleased that they could join us, give us some new ideas and energy. And so, Lindsay will be serving as a co-moderator this afternoon as well. And Tom was available to serve also. And the last two persons are Evan Tweed and Dave Willis. They've been participants on our planning committee for several years, and they will be helping us during our program as co-hosts as well. So we want to thank all those people for their help on being able to provide this workshop for you. So that's my comments. I'm going to turn the program over to Angie.
One more person that's not listed on this slide is Heather Dufault. She works for the University of Minnesota Extension, and she's going to be doing some of the behind the scenes work that makes these sorts of webinars happen. And so we're really glad that Heather could help out as well. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jochum Wiersma, who's the small grains extension agronomist, small grain specialist in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics at the University of Minnesota, St. Paul. He's stationed at the Northwest Regional Outreach Center in Crookston, where he's been since 1995. He came to us originally from the Netherlands, getting his PhD in plant breeding at the University of Minnesota. His primary responsibilities with his current job is as extension professor with extension 80% and 20% research, responsibilities for small grain production in the state of Minnesota, As a small grain specialist stationed in Northwest Research and Outreach Center's extension mission is to develop educational programs, to organize grower and industry meetings, and to handle inquiries and requests from the public. His extension program is a balance between providing answers to immediate problems and developing research-based information to structurally improve small grains production and the production system it is placed in. The goal of Dr. Wiersma's research program is to provide solutions for problems that producers face and for which the literature does not provide an applicable answer. Noble goal. Jochum Wiersma. Jochum, take it away.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jochum Wiersma, and most years I probably would give a talk about variety updates, hardwood springweed variety trials, or on-farm research. This year, a little bit different subject, and rather than being somewhere at the end of the program, I'm actually now the lead-off speaker, which makes me a little bit nervous. And so I'll stop the bobblehead animation now in the corner, and then we'll get into the presentation itself. The more acres, less time, and how do you address climate weirdness subject came out of some discussions when we were brainstorming about subject matter for this upcoming Zoom season. And I had remembered a extension publication that John Enns, the former NDSU state climatologist, had published in the early 90s called The Potential Field Work Days During Planting and Harvesting. And we've had two really weird years behind us, where in 2019, half the sugar beet acres didn't get harvested in the Red River Valley, which had never happened before. We've had, massive sprout damage that same year in the springweed. And so I wondered if something had changed over the years since that early 90s. John Enns actually published that. It was a iteration of a publication that had come out in 1969, where they looked at weather and profitable machinery size. Now, these two graphs below are not high resolution because I could only find the digital format of the pictures. But in the heart of the valley, we have about 12 days in 90% of the years to get all the crop planted. We have a 90% probability of getting it done with those 12 days available to us. Likewise, harvest, we have a 90% probability across years that we have about 20 days to get the harvest done. As you go further north, those numbers get smaller, where in the most northern part, there's only about 8 days. And as you go further south, the southern tip of the valley has about 18 days to get the crop planted and about 18 days to harvest the crop. So that made me wonder, are things changing? And of course, we then have to think about climate change. Now, I don't call it climate change, I call it climate weirdness. And I do that on purpose, not to turn you off. This is a controversial subject, and emotions tend to run very high, but I just want to look at the data. Now, first of all, we have to start out with some climate and weather definitions. Weather is basically the short-term conditions in the atmosphere, what we're getting. As of this morning, it was rather nippy, not uncommon for this time of the year. But if we look long-term, and generally climate gets expressed in what they call a 30-year normal, this is about average for this time of year. And climate is indeed the average daily weather for an extended period of time at a particular location, is what you expect. Now, one of the things is that this is a continental climate. And as Bob Bush pointed out when he picked me up from the airport in 1991, well, if you don't like the heat and humidity now, wait till tomorrow, or wait 5 minutes and the weather will change. we have very large weather extremes because we have a continental climate. Nonetheless, there are climatic cycles at play that are basically nested physical mechanisms that operate on the weather and the climate that we endure or encounter or enjoy in the northern plains. Those physical mechanisms are cyclical variations, and there are multiple time scales from just a few years to decades to centuries and millennia. One of the shortest ones that all of you are familiar with is, for instance, the El Nino and La Nina oscillation in the central Pacific Ocean in front of the coast of Peru. We also have in the northern Pacific, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and that one actually has a lot of influence on our weather and our climate as well. And then we have an Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And that one apparently is now changing basically from one state to the next state. Now, how those oscillations play out in our climate and eventually our weather is, for instance, this. In the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, it really helps explain the wet and dry cycles that are common in the Canadian provinces and the northern Great Plains. If there's a cold PDO, we tend to be wetter along either side of the Canadian, US border. If we tend to get in a warm PDO, we tend to get into a dry cycle along that border. And it, for example, explains the rise and fall of Devil's Lake that has been seen for eons. They know this simply by looking at sedimentation records, and they've seen that indeed Devil's Lake cycles every 20 or so years from low levels to very high levels. The question then becomes, okay, are these oscillations changing? Well, if you look at, for instance, the annual precipitation and the scab risk, right now we were in a wet cycle again. This is the oscillation that is largely explained by the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And we were in a number of dry years, basically from the mid-2000s to about 2015, we were relatively dry and we were in an upswing again. And we've seen in the last 2 years a higher risk of scab. If this one continues now, the question becomes indeed, okay, are we going to stay wet or are we going to go back to a drier cycle like in between? Those are one of the questions that is hard to answer because they're projections. Nonetheless, up to this point, those cycles have been maintained. Now, climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that we've seen, that we have records of, that go above and beyond those expected that those are expected and predicted. Now, the one that is without a doubt the clearest to see is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. Right now, we are over 400 parts per million, which is 100 parts per million, a third higher than it's ever been previously reported in basically in the samples that have been taken. The last peak was about 350,000 years ago. Now, the scientific consensus of that is that change is primarily driven by human activity, in particular fossil fuel burning. And that has an influence on, indeed, all these climatic cycles. As Leon Osborne pointed out to me, he was really interested to see whether or not the Devil's Lake Basin was going to dry out again. If the Devil's Lake Basin wasn't drying out in basically the current cycle, then there would indeed be a big change in those long-term oscillations that we have encountered up to this point. So we have to understand that the climate that we have is not just climate change, if indeed it is occurring, it is also still all those other oscillations that occur as well. Now, if we look at the climate projections for Minnesota and eastern North Dakota, the projections are that it's going to get warmer in the mid-latitudes, especially a more pronounced effect on the T-min and T-max during the winter months, meaning that we're going to have milder winters. But we're going to have cooler and wetter starts at the beginning of the growing season that are cooler than they currently have been. And I'll explain why that is happening. The warmer is also more pronounced, the T-min, so the minimum nighttime temperatures, that effect is more pronounced during the summer, where the T-maxes actually are only slightly increasing. And the reason those things are happening is largely because we're getting wetter, which means we have higher relative humidities, and water vapor just holds an awful lot of heat, which means that it just is much harder to cool down at night. But it also explains, if we indeed are wetter, why we have not just wetter winters with more snowfall, but also wetter and cooler springs. Now, during the months of June, July, and August, that high humidity with very warm nights is gonna more than likely result in a higher incidence and greater severity of what Mark Seeley always called precipitation singularities, very large extreme thunderstorms that bring 4, 8, or 10 inches of precip in a very short amount of time. Those really extreme thunderstorms, which is basically a cycle that we already know because we are in that continental climate and it takes water to make water is a very common saying here. Those convection thunderstorms are likely to increase in severity and incidence. So the really freak storms, the frequency of those are going to increase. That has an influence also on our cropping and brownouts and flooding, etc. In a short way to summarize it, what the projections are, and there is higher bounds and lower bounds as far as probability. It looks like we're going to be, if the whole state of Minnesota, if you take the whole state of Minnesota and eastern North Dakota, we're shifting down to where Iowa, Missouri, and eastern Kansas are today. That really changes what we call our weather and our climate. And it changes more than likely our cropping systems. So what are those growing season consequences? Well, higher CO2 concentrations have already been advantageous to C3 crops, soybeans, wheat, sugar beets, and they're going to continue to be advantageous for CO2 for C3 crops until that temperature signal gets large enough that those gains are offset by higher temperatures. And I'll get back to that. It's not as advantageous for C4 species, corn. We're going to have a longer growing season that is going to get weighted more towards the end of the growing season, so longer falls. Those higher humidities, those higher dew points are more disadvantageous for cool season annuals like wheat compared to warm season annuals. Why? Because respiration rates are going to go up during the nighttime, leaving less of the sugars produced to be put towards yield. And because of those thunderstorms, we're going to see higher risk of flooding and brownouts. And so, given all that, that is predicted, I just went back to John Enns' publication and wondered if something is changing, given that we had 2 really weird years. And so I went to, rather than using John Enns' methodology, because I don't have access to all of the end-on data to be able to do that, same calculations, I went the way a little bit different. And so I started playing with data, and I used, and unfortunately it's for the whole state of Minnesota, it's not, I can't parse it out by cropping district for, say, just Northwest Minnesota. I went to days suitable for field work, which is reported weekly in the crop progress report during the growing season. And it starts in sometime in April, and then they ended actually at the end, last day of November. What I did is I just regressed the cumulative recorded number of field days suitable for field work as reported for each week. And I basically regressed it on the week of the year. And then I recorded the intercept, the slope, and the residual mean square error for each of those years. Why the slope? Well, that tells me something about whether or not the number of days over the time has changed. And the residual mean square error tells me something about how noisy the data is. And that's important because if every week is close to the average, then you would have a very small residual mean square error. But if you have weeks on end where you can't be in the field, followed by weeks on end where you can be in the field, you would have means that are much further away in those periods from the predicted average. That will result in a larger residual mean square error in the regression analysis. So I got those values for each of the years, and then I regressed the slope of each year and the residual mean square error for each year over years. So it's a 2-step analysis. Now, if we just look at the length of the growing season, there's not much going on. It's all over the board. It varies from 29 weeks, which was the shortest in 2003, to 35 weeks, and there really isn't much of a pattern. If we look at the start of the season, it's all over the board too, from week 13, which is the 1st of April, to week 18, which is, 5 weeks later, the 1st week of May. But there really isn't a pattern. On average, we start somewhere in Minnesota, somewhere between week 15 and 16, if I had to say it. But as you know, on average doesn't mean much around here. The end of the season is a little bit more interesting, where up to 2004, we would now and then not make it till the end of November. Since 2004, we've made it to the end of November every single year in the reporting. And they stop at that. And so I don't have data to report whether or not it goes now into December. But that's you can see a pattern here. We've now routinely go all the way to the end of November. But if you look a little bit closer into this data and you look at those regressions within years and then do that 2-step process, if we look for the whole season, indeed, it doesn't look like really anything is going on, except we had a period of very average years up to about 2005, followed by a period where we've had longer than average days, more than average days per week to complete field work. And now we are in a period since 2015 where we have fewer than average days to complete our field work in each of those weeks. But across that 20 years of data, or 25 years of data, the regression basically is flat. If you, however, look at the residual mean square error across those years, this regression is statistically significant and it's pulling it down. And I'll come back to that, what that means. If you look for the spring, there isn't much going on, maybe trending up a little bit, but it really is just barely statistically significant. And you have to, there's not much going on, basically. Residual mean square error, likewise, there isn't much going on in the spring. In the fall, however, we see this downward trend that basically probably explains the whole season. This one is statistically significant. And especially if you look at the residual mean square error, that trend becomes more pronounced, where since 2013 being last year, we're pulling it down towards a smaller residual mean square error. So what does that mean? Well, my interpretation is that the average number of days suitable for field work for the whole season has not changed over time. We can see, in each of the weeks, we have a number of average years followed by a period where we had above average, and now we're in a period with below average number of days suitable for field work each week. And while the days in the spring may be trended up just slightly, it is trending down in the fall, which is somewhat unexpected, maybe based on the climate projections. Now, if you look at the residual mean square error in this period where I did this analysis, the residual mean square error is trending down for the whole season. And what that means to me is that basically the periods in which we can complete field work are on average getting shorter in each of those weeks. In other words, we have a more rapid succession of little dry periods with wet periods. In the spring, it seems to be stable, but it is apparently it's really showing up in the fall analysis. Again, that's probably maybe counterintuitive or unexpected based on the overall projection that our growing season is getting longer. So that leads me to this conclusion and basically the title that we're going to have less time to cover more acres. Why? Well, in the case of cool season crops like wheat, the early bird still gets the worm. Sugar beets, you want to plant as early as possible. Corn, if you really want to maximize yield, you're going to have to plant early. And so the early bird still gets the worm. Also, if harvest is getting more challenging, for a number of commodities, that is problematic because the final quality of the harvested product matters. Sprout damage basically, is a huge discount in the case of wheat. And we still continue to grow larger individual operations, meaning you're going to have more acres. Now, how do you solve that dilemma? You solve it the same way we've always done it, with basically economies of scale, and probably we have to go back to economies of scope. Now, I'll try to explain economies of scale and economies of scope in the next couple of slides. With this, economies of scale, basically bigger, better, faster. But bigger, better, faster is a balancing act of cost and capacity. If you have fewer days, the first inclination is to get bigger equipment. Bigger equipment comes with a cost. Now, eventually you could invest too much equipment and get what we would call diseconomies of scale, where you just have too much equipment. That means that your cost of production per unit of whatever you're selling, whatever that commodity is that blue portion of this graph. And so that's a problem. Now, on top of that, one of the problems with bigger and faster is that we are going to run into what I would call technical and logistical limits. You can only go so fast with a 130-foot spray boom without it not snapping off, because all the principles of physics and Newton's laws apply. Likewise, we might run into problems with how wide we can go. You get to enjoy combines that are larger than your counterparts in Europe can use, simply because they're not allowed on the road. They're too wide to be able to be on public roads, and therefore they have to settle for smaller combines. When that happens, you have to buy more combines. Okay, there's a step in that. And if that means that you all of a sudden now have overcapacity for the acres that you have, one of the solutions is to indeed having to partner with your neighbors, either for individual activities or for crop enterprises, because you want to stay in this bottom part of your economies of scale equation. Now, I looked at that for Northwest Minnesota using the FinBin data for wheat on rented land from 1999 to 2019. And if you look at machinery cost as a percentage of the cost of production per acre, and that has to be the world's worst abbreviation, MCAPPCPA, we can see that over time, we are spending, or you are spending, our producers, your clients are spending a larger portion of the total cost on machinery. That would suggest indeed that we are getting past maybe that bottom, that blue line in the economies of scale equation. If you, however, look at the machinery cost as a percentage of the price per bushel received, there's nothing going on. This is basically a flat line. And part of that is because, prices received, this is without any government payments, fluctuate greatly. But that also means that I think most producers still, even though they're spending more on equipment on a per acre basis, run about as lean as they can, because the machinery cost as a percentage of price per bushel received is relatively constant. And so I think we're doing what producers are doing what they're supposed to do. Now, what are economies of scope? Basically, simply put, it's diversification. It's using the same equipment on different enterprises. And we've always done this. But because of economies of scale, we are a lot less diverse than we used to be. And maybe we have to reintroduce some diversification to allow that equipment to be spread over more enterprises, if indeed the trends that I showed you in our production season are indeed continuing. So what are some options for diversification? Well, we can substitute part of the acres of a crop enterprise that have different planting and harvest windows. Basically, something that we've always done is spreading the workload. But we've gone away from that because we grow fewer barley acres. We grow overall fewer sunflower acres. Buckwheat has all but disappeared. Flax has all but disappeared. But buckwheat, for instance, can be planted later and still work out. So that really spreads that planting window for open, where you don't have to have all the spring wheat in at the same time. Sunflowers can get planted later. It's one of the reasons soybeans is such a great fit. Soybeans has a lot of latitude when it comes to planting date without having yield penalties. We can substitute part of the acres of time-sensitive crop enterprises with those that are less time-sensitive. In other words, we try to reduce our weather risks. Sunflowers are less time sensitive than dry beans when it comes to harvest. Corn is less time sensitive than wheat is, unfortunately. But it allows you to manage that weather risk for harvest because end-use quality makes a difference. And finally, we substitute part of the acres to higher margin specialty varieties or production system of an existing enterprise you already have the capacity and expertise in. It basically means if you have higher margin, you can afford lower yields, and so your planting date doesn't become as critical. And examples of that would be organic production or food-grade soybeans, conventional or organic, doesn't matter. So those are some options for diversification. And with that, you can also still apply to partnering, where, you know, that excess capacity that you have, you partner with neighbors to maximize economies of scale on that equipment to keep your cost of production down. So with that said, any questions? I'll be live for the question session, and hopefully if you have any, you dare to ask them. If not, use my email or text or call me on my cell phone, because due to COVID-19, I'm mostly residing in my basement, which I've turned into my office for the time being. With that, having said anything, thank you.